Buster Keaton. He was not so financially successful as the other two, but still very, very popular at the time. His films were largely successes, although notably The General was a big flop at the time, and The General is one of his greatest films, which didn't get appreciated until much later. Well, okay, there's Chaplin, and there's the range of Chaplin expressions. I have to say that Chaplin is more deadpan than he's often given credit for. He's got a nice line in Embarrassed Giggles, but largely the expression we see there with the dog or the one in the corner, that slightly browbeaten look is most commonly used. Lloyd has, of course, got a huge range of facial expressions. Keaton was called the Great Stone Face, the idea that he didn't express anything at all. This is utter nonsense. He had an incredibly expressive face. He just chose as his screen persona to not smile, but a huge range of emotions, from mild surprise to abject horror to deep embarrassment to complete bewilderment. They're all there. It's just he does it all without the smile. And if you look at the early films that he makes, he does smile. The early films he does comes from bumping into Fatty Arbuckle, who knew him from his stage work and said, "Do you want to be in the movies?" Keaton had kind of poo-pooed the movies, but decided to go along for the gig and absolutely fell in love with the process. So though he never worked for Keystone, he did work for Fatty Arbuckle's own company, spelt comique or pronounced comique, apparently by everybody who worked there. And in these early films as Fatty Arbuckle's foil, he does smile. We still see the Keaton persona there to a large extent, but there are smiles. So where does this great stone face come from? It's from his background in vaudeville. So if Chaplin comes from the lowest class and Lloyd comes from an aspirational middle class, Keaton is kind of from a sort of classless society. So he's an outsider. And he grew up essentially on stage as part of the family vaudeville act, which was, by all accounts, incredibly violent and involved lots of the young Buster being thrown around by his father. He had suitcase handles sewn into the back of his jacket so his father could physically pick him up, swing him around, and then chuck him. The young Buster learned that the less he reacted on stage, the more of a laugh he got if he just looked up from this excessive violence with a sort of what just happened look. It turned out to be funnier. And this develops into his screen persona. And when he moves on from the Arbuckle movies, we see much, much more of that, and the smile vanishes. He's also got quite an interesting approach to romance. Whereas with Chaplin and his relationship with Edna Purviance and Jabina Ralston, who we saw in the Lloyd films, they provided an interesting dynamic. There's never a female character in a Keaton film that serves much more than a function of needing to be rescued or won. The focus is on Keaton. Sometimes it's a love quest, but essentially the women could be entirely interchangeable. And in the film Go West, the great relationship is with a cow. So at the end of the film, having won the day, the farmer offers Buster his daughter's hand in marriage, and he decides he'd rather take the cow, thanks very much. Buster's own marriage doesn't seem to have been a particularly happy affair. Perhaps he was feeling jaundiced in terms of relationships. We see it again in The General. Well, this is the girl he has to rescue, but the publicity shots where everyone's pulling the Keaton stoneface expression. As a filmmaker, he finds comedy in geometry, and this is a massive contradiction. The films are ordered. The lines that we see in the film are very dynamic, but we see lots of straight lines or curves, that shapes essentially. And given that the world in which Keaton inhabits frequently falls into chaos, it's a very interesting juxtaposition. There are so many great Keaton moments. It was impossible to choose just one, so I went for montage. Look at the editing, how we go from one shot to another, and that there's a rhythm there, but also look at the compositions that we see. So the Keaton world, it reminds me of an illustration by Escher, especially the one where he's chasing the dog. You may know those pictures, the guy's going up the stairs, but the stairs don't go anywhere. That's, I think, tapping the same strain of mathematical surrealism there. And that's what I think is at the heart of what Keaton does. And that's the highly elaborate camera movement we get there. He's setting up the gag. So we've got that crane shot going up and down that set of the stairs where he ends up on the roof. So lots of play with the camera. Most of the stunts will be in long shot and usually in one take, so that we can see that there's not a trick there. He really is doing these incredibly dangerous things. He broke every bone in his body at some point or another. But some of the other gags rely on what cinema as a medium can do. So if the world is order and chaos, then so is cinema. Film as a medium can produce this randomness, but also it has a logical beauty to it. So I've got two clips. One is really short. It's from The Cameraman, where he aspires to be a filmmaker. And then the other one is from Sherlock Jr., where he's a cinema projectionist and he's just been rejected by his girl who thinks that he's stolen her father's watch and he's been framed. So we'll see these two clips and see the way he's playing with film as a medium and the plasticity of film. Really quite unique. And it looks like something out of Monty Python's Flying Circus, but that's 40 odd years later. Obviously, there's an influence there. So we see this kind of order and chaos. The stunts will be done in one shot because he wants to preserve the reality. But in terms of editing or camera positioning, he wants to show us the fluidity and possibilities of film as a medium. We see lots of symmetrical construction and mise en scène. As a result, he's influenced such different filmmakers as Jackie Chan for the stunts, and Wes Anderson is obviously a big fan in terms of composition and geometry. I haven't got time to show you, but in the Playhouse, he does the multiple exposure trick and fills an entire theatre of busters, audience, backstage, on stage, and orchestra. And then there's, of course, the stunts. We've got last few minutes and we should have time for Steamboat Bill Jr., which is one of his most stunt-riddled epics. And that famous shot of the building falling down around Buster framed in the window, all done in one take. If he'd moved an inch to the left or right, he could have been killed. And apparently he was in a very strange mood at the time of filming. His producer and brother-in-law had sold off Buster's own production company to MGM, which was to prove disastrous for Buster and his filmmaking and lead eventually to alcoholism. His marriage was dissolving, so there's speculation that he was semi-suicidal at the time of shooting the sequence. I'm not sure if that's true, but let's have a look at this fantastic sequence from Steamboat Bill Jr. We don't need to worry about the plot, it's just a hurricane. going from the splits to a standing position. How did he do that? So, Keaton auteur, geometry is funny. The world is chaotic but curiously ordered. Things tend to turn out all right in the end, though he does put in a few sour moments to his happy endings. The ending of college ends in a wedding, and then there's a strange montage of parenthood, old age, and death. But the world is generally chaotic. The interest in cinema as a medium, what filmmaking can do. Lots of dreams in Keaton's films explains a lot of the surrealism. He woke up and it was all a dream. Might be a bit of a hoary old cliche, but it works. However, he likes to go out on location, and he was very meticulous about his mise en scène. So the general is set during the American Civil War, and he used actual props, costumes, trains, everything. He really wanted to go for verisimilitude for any of his locations. There's a real kineticism to both the camera and movement, and also to his physicality. No pathos, certainly not in the same way that Chaplin wants us to feel sorry for him. I think we do feel something for Buster. His screen character feels slightly autistic, and we worry about him. We understand that the world is a bewildering place. Unlike Lloyd, no character development. The Keaton character is fairly consistent. He can play it across all classes. So sometimes he'll be upper class, sometimes very working class. He's never a tramp. He's always honest, unlike Chaplin's clown. But the character is essentially the same. I wanted to wrap up by just finding a few pictures of them together. I couldn't find a single picture of the three of them at any one time, but there is Lloyd and Chaplin and Douglas Fairbanks together in the 20s. There is Keaton and Chaplin in their only film together in Limelight. I love this picture. This is the late 1950s, Lloyd on the right in the glasses, and there's Keaton laughing his head off at something. There we go. Bang on time, I think. That is the end.